Data from many aspects of Canadians' lives routinely travels through U.S. computers and sometimes is shared with U.S. officials. According to our next guest, that means an executive order issued by the new president might put your privacy at risk in ways you'd never expect. Joining us now to explain from our nation's capital, here's Michael Geist, Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa. And Michael, it's always good to have you back on TVO. How's it going tonight?
It's going well. Thanks so much for having me.
Glad to hear it. All right, a couple days before President Trump signed an executive order known as the travel ban, he put his signature on another order called Enhancing Public Safety in the Interior of the United States. That didn't get quite as much attention, but what was that executive order designed to do?
Well, that was his first step towards dealing with what obviously Trump sees as terrorist threats in the United States, and it granted a series of powers to some of the various agencies that they have. But buried within that was a provision that dealt with privacy. And in it, it rolled back what had emerged over many years as a longstanding approach to begin to provide better privacy protections to non-U.S. citizens and non-U.S. permanent residents. The law in the United States has long been under the Privacy Act that privacy for us, if you're a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, but not for everybody else. And over the decades since that law was passed, U.S. agencies gradually began to see the merit in trying to extend some of those same privacy protections to foreigners or to people who didn't otherwise qualify. With the simple effort of a pen signing that executive order, Trump rolled all of that back, said that there should be no presumptions of privacy protection for people that didn't strictly qualify under the law. And that quite clearly would affect Canadians like it would millions and billions of other people around the world.
And what's your theory as to why he did it?
Well, it's hard to figure out some of the thinking generally when it comes to the new president. But in this case, I think generally he sees this as part of a broader initiative where foreigners, in his view, are more likely to engage in terrorist or criminal activity. And so any attempts to provide them with privacy protection, I suppose, in his view, might undermine that. I don't know that he's necessarily thinking specifically of Canadians when he thinks about this. One would hope that he wouldn't. But nevertheless, the sweeping approach that he's taken when it comes to rolling back the kinds of privacy protections that entities like the Department of Homeland Security in the United States had begun to extend to citizens of other countries means that Canadians are caught within that approach.
In which case, to what extent do you think, if this goes ahead the way you fear it will, to what extent will the National Security Agency in the States be able to get its hands on Canadians' personal data?
Well, I mean, that raises a couple of things. And I think first we should say it's gone ahead. Much like the travel ban, absent court stepping in, it's on. And so in this case, it's on. The rollback in terms of the privacy protections is already in effect. The executive order had that effect. The questions then come up, one, as you suggest, what is the likelihood that we're going to see the U.S. access or capture this information? And I guess secondarily, but just as important, what kind of privacy protections will Canadians have when that data falls into the hands of the U.S. government, whether it's the government or one of its agencies? And to the latter question, it seems fairly clear that what this now means is that where the Canadian data, the personal information, would have been protected to a certain extent anyway under the Privacy Act in the United States, that simply isn't going to be the case anymore. Why this becomes a real source of concern really speaks to your question, and that has to do with the sheer amount of information that does find its way into the U.S. government, from Canadians. Sometimes it's handed over directly, government-to-government information sharing. Sometimes it's simply captured by the United States as part of its surveillance activity. But either way, it's in the hands of U.S. governments and some of its agencies, and we now learn that the kind of privacy protection associated with that, at least under the Privacy Act, has largely been eliminated.
I guess I prefaced the question the way I did because when they announced the travel ban and the travel suspension, almost instantly there were legal challenges to that, and as a result it's now sort of caught up in a, is it on or is it off, and there's tons of confusion around it. Perhaps because this one flew under the radar somewhat, the legal response to it has not yet happened in as forceful a way, and I guess I'm wondering whether you think someone at some point is going to sue the U.S. government about this, and therefore it may not have the teeth that you fear it will?
That's an interesting question, and you're right. I mean, there's just been so much activity. Every day seems like a week or a month sometimes under this administration, and so a lot of these executive orders and a lot of the activity ultimately get lost in the noise because there's just so much of it. I'm not sure that we will necessarily see a legal challenge in the United States, although certainly that's possible. It does seem possible that we could see legal challenges in other countries where their citizens' personal information is directly affected. In fact, that's exactly what we saw, in a sense, in the European Union, where in one of the high-profile cases brought by former law student Max Schrems, he challenged the information sharing activities between the European Union and the United States. In particular, he challenged an agreement that existed between the EU and the United States that allowed for the free flow of information between the two countries, or between the EU and the United States. And he argued that the surveillance activities in the United States and the lack of privacy protections were reasons enough not to ensure that that information could go so easily back and forth, and that in fact it was a violation of European law. Given that we're seeing the Trump administration pull back on the kinds of privacy protections that it affords to non-U.S. citizens and non-U.S. permanent residents, it seems possible that this will resurface again. And rather than necessarily seeing cases in the United States, it's possible we could see cases certainly in the European Union, or perhaps even here in Canada, if Canadians were to learn that some of the information that their own government is sharing with the United States doesn't have the kind of privacy protections that they otherwise believe it should enjoy.
Well, let me follow up on that angle, because I suspect many Canadians know about the Five Eyes organization, which, if memory serves, is Canada, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand. Have I got that right? Did I get them all?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes, you did.
And you know, they're probably assuming that all of those countries and their security organizations are already sharing a lot of their personal and or private data already. So does this actually make things that much more, if you're concerned about privacy, egregious? What's your view?
Well, I think we're entering really uncharted territory generally with the direction that we're seeing with the United States, and we're seeing it for the Five Eyes as well. Of course, one of the other events that took place in the first couple of weeks of the Trump administration was suddenly to characterize or to paint Australia as not a particularly friendly ally of the United States. And they are, as you mentioned, a member of Five Eyes, which really does in some ways call into question whether or not the arrangements that have been long-standing and the cooperation that has been long-standing between those countries will continue. We see tensions also certainly with the United Kingdom. And we've, of course, in Canada so far attempted to kind of play it cool a little bit, and certainly obviously not try to antagonize the United States, focused very much on the trade relationship. But should we see the Trump administration give directions to its agencies to use information in ways that would run afoul of our own law, it would, I think, fall to Canadian agencies to say simply we cannot share that information on an ongoing basis, given some of the activities that are taking place within one of our partners in this. And so I think this really does raise, not just in terms of that executive order that we started with, but in terms of that general direction about the kind of privacy that will be afforded to information from those outside the United States, the kind of relationships that may exist between the United States and some of its longstanding allies, does in a sense put some of these issues at play in a way that was scarcely imaginable even a few years ago.
Well, one of the organizations in this country whose mission is to look out for our privacy and or civil rights is the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and they released this statement earlier this month on this topic. They said Canada must immediately review the impact of our information sharing agreements with the United States. Canada cannot enable discrimination based on country of origin, ethnic origin, or religious beliefs. Canada must ensure that innocent persons are not put at risk by information provided by Canada. Canada must use this opportunity to set clear limits on information shared with the United States. In which case, what do you think the government of Canada ought to do at this moment, given all of what we've just discussed?
Well, I think the CCLA is absolutely right on this, that given what we're seeing, and of course it's a difficult issue because it is moving so quickly and the rules of the game in a sense are changing so quickly that it's very difficult to respond in a sense in real time. But it seems to me absolutely essential that we get the Privacy Commissioner of Canada to conduct a thorough review of the various information sharing arrangements, layer in what we're now seeing take place in the United States, and better identify whether or not some of the information sharing that we thought was lawful before may now fall into the area of illegality under Canadian law. And I think we need a clear commitment from the government that it's going to not just take a look at the issue, but it's going to act where necessary. We've already seen, and this is where the layering of multiple executive orders and actions come into play. We've already seen how there may be, in a sense, connections between the executive order that would affect some of the privacy issues with some of the travel ban issues, with Canadian residents losing their Nexus cards, questions about whether dual citizens can cross into the border, which remains a bit of an ongoing concern for many. And so those sorts of issues, which really do involve both large amounts of information sharing in advance and sometimes in real time, points to the prospect that the two countries are moving in different directions when it comes to the protection of privacy, when it comes to the way that they treat different people based on the kinds of indicia that you just mentioned, whether that's race, religion, and the like. And I think that many Canadians, I would hope that all Canadians would say that the direction that we're seeing take place elsewhere is not the kind of direction we want to see this country take place, and it is inconsistent with our fundamental charter values and the legal rights that those people have.
Well, I appreciate your position on that, and of course, you don't come to us today as a political scientist. You're an expert in e-commerce and law. But having said that, I wonder if it's fair to say that the Trudeau government really finds itself walking a difficult tightrope at the moment, in as much as they probably agree with you and side with you on all these issues, but they do not want to, what's the expression we should use here? They don't want to stir the beast up, right? They are very concerned about staying on the right side of the new American administration. So what hope do you have that they're going to pursue what you'd like to see here?
I have some amount of hope, but I think you're right. I don't think you have to be a political scientist to see that we are between that proverbial rock and a hard place on this issue. Where on the one hand, we have, I think, as a nation and many Canadians, belief in values that we are seeing our longstanding closest ally begin potentially to shift away from, at least at the presidential level, and the prospect that as those rules change, that the gulf or the divide may grow over time. Now listen, I think it's obvious the trade relationship is critically important to Canada. I think it's important to the United States as well, and obviously Canadian officials have been emphasizing that. But at the same time, while I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to directly poke the Trump administration, I think it does make sense. Indeed, I think it is essential to emphasize that there are Canadian values here, and that and Canadian laws, and should U.S. policies run afoul of those, Canada has to take a stand and say that's simply a place we're not willing to go to. Indeed, in a sense, the dust-up with Australia recently really seems to have been precipitated, at least in part, from the fact that their prime minister simply took a more aggressive position and made it clear that there were certain principles and certain agreements that he expected the United States to stand by, and certainly seemed like that President Trump didn't take too kindly to that.
Okay, Michael, let's finish up here on this Glenn Greenwald piece in the Washington Post. I'll quote an excerpt of it now. Beginning in his first month in office and continuing through today, Obama not only continued many of the most extreme executive power policies he once condemned, but in many cases strengthened and extended them. Blinded by the belief that Obama was too benevolent and benign to abuse his office and drowning in partisan loyalties at the expense of political principles, Democrats consecrated this framework with their acquiescence and often their explicit approval. This is the unrestrained set of powers Trump will inherit. I don't want to be inordinately inflammatory here when I ask this question, but I do wonder whether you're concerned that the new president will use the National Security Agency's servers to seek out information and punish his political enemies, which his critics would say is not completely beyond possibility. Let's put it that way.
Right. Well, I mean, I think certainly his critics, I think, do point to those issues, and many, including Greenwald, of course, have pointed to the concerns that many of the kinds of powers and certainly the infrastructure that he inherits comes really from starting from Bush, but of course it was continued through Obama. I'm not sure that it's totally fair to suggest that everybody just acquiesced along the way. We've of course talked in the past about the Snowden revelations and the consequences of that, which have been playing out now for a number of years. And I think it's fair to say that there were many that did stand up and object to what they were learning. And indeed, the kind of debate that took place in the United States about what was appropriate was in certain respects far more robust than we've experienced here in Canada. I mean, we're still debating what to do about C-51. In the United States, they at least took on board some of the kinds of things that Snowden had been revealing and didn't necessarily change everything the way that I think a lot of people in the privacy and civil liberties community would have liked to have seen and would still like to see. But at least there was a more open discussion about some of these issues, and I think in a way that we haven't yet had here. The potential, though, and really getting to your question, the potential for misuse or abuse, I think is an enormous fear. And it's a fear that ought to resonate not just in the United States, but really on a global level because of the kind of surveillance that we now understand takes place, and indeed for Canadians. Because so much of our internet traffic ultimately ends up in the United States, so that even if we're sending what would feel like a domestic correspondence, you send an email to your neighbor or to somebody in another city here in Canada, it's entirely possible, indeed it's often quite likely, that that message will go into the United States and then in a sense boomerang or come back into Canada. You don't see that taking place, but the NSA and the surveillance agencies in the United States certainly do.
As always, Michael, you give us a lot to think about, which is why we're always grateful for your appearances here on this program. Thanks so much again.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Steve.
Michael Geist, law professor, University of Ottawa.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.